America is undeniably a nation of immigrants, but Americans have never really liked immigration all that much. This is reflected in polling of modern America, but while all of this immigration was occurring, from Western and Eastern Europe, South and Central America, and Asia, animus against these immigrant populations was far greater. We've certainly become a far more open-minded society, and open bigotry and discrimination in hiring, service, and most other circumstances is not only frowned upon, but illegal. Nonetheless, hesitance towards allowing immigrants into America has persisted. So the question stands, what should US immigration policy be? To answer this question, let's start with the history of US immigration policy. Starting with our nation's founding, we really didn't have too much legislation on immigration, meaning basically open borders. This did not mean that everyone could be a citizen, though. That status was restricted to white Americans, and people arriving in America, regardless of race, could not be citizens. This changed in 1790 with the Naturalization Act, which established the process of granting citizenship to, quote, any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for a term of 2 years. The candidate is also required to prove they are of good character, and they must take an oath to the Constitution. The 1795 Naturalization Act established a clearer process of naturalization, while extending the required duration of residence from 2 years to 5 years. Then, shit got weird with the French, and the Federalists went a bit overboard with the Alien and Sedition Acts. This is a collection of 4 bills. The first is the Sedition Act, which criminalized false and malicious statements about the government. Basically, it's a bald-faced attack on the First Amendment. So how was this allowed? Well, it's complicated, but basically the Supreme Court didn't really have the authority to deem a law unconstitutional until the 1800s. Fortunately, this law expired after a set date. The second bill is the Alien Friends Act, which allowed the president to imprison and deport non-citizens, and this also expired on a set date. The third bill is the Naturalization Act of 1798, which extended the required duration of residence from 5 years to 14 years. However, this was repealed in 1802. Finally, we have the Alien Enemies Act, which gave the president special powers to detain non-citizens during times of war, and this is still in effect to this day. So, coming into the 19th century, we've basically got open borders, and after about 5 years of residence, assuming you're a Christian white male of good standing, you can become a citizen. Things remained largely the same until the Civil War. Say what you will about more than 600,000 Americans dying, having the most bigoted and conservative part of your nation break off and lose all political power in Congress allows for some pretty radical change. Shortly after the Civil War, during early Reconstruction, was arguably the most radical Congress of all of American history, that is, compared to the opinions of the average American at the time. So how did this impact immigration policy? Well, we got the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which was initially created to protect the rights of recently freed slaves, but also created birthright citizenship in America. And 2 years later, this right to citizenship based on being born on US soil was enshrined in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. 2 years after the ratification of the 14th Amendment, the Naturalization Act of 1870 expanded the naturalization process to African Americans. What do these post-Civil War bills have to do with immigration? Well, nothing directly, but birthright citizenship allows for loopholes like anchor babies, where undocumented immigrants come into this nation and have children to give them a better claim in the immigration courts, to not be deported. But all good things must come to an end. And after a few bad compromises, a loss of political will for Reconstruction, and a crackdown on black civil rights in the South, the post-Civil War honeymoon came careening down. In 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, banning all immigration of laborers from China for 10 years. This was done in response to the increasing trend of Chinese migrant labor coming in and outcompeting domestic laborers, taking jobs, depressing wages, and increasing labor quotas during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. It made exceptions for merchants, teachers, students, travelers, and diplomats, but it was the first major federal law to target a specific national group and ban them from immigrating to the US. But it would not be the last. When the 10-year expiration date came, it was renewed and strengthened in the Geary Act, and was made permanent in 1902. Keep in mind that the same year the Geary Act was passed, Ellis Island started allowing European immigrants in from the East Coast. Over the course of its operation, Ellis Island would allow over 12 million immigrants into the United States. And after a few waves of immigration from 1905 to 1907 of Japanese people fleeing the harsh conditions of the Russo-Japanese War, the US negotiated with Japanese politicians to restrict immigration from Japan in a series of notes collectively referred to as the Gentleman's Agreement. The Immigration Act of 1917 expanded restrictions on East Asian countries in general, and the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 established a maximum allowed number of immigrants from certain countries. The Immigration Act of 1924 further expanded limitations on East Asian immigration, but also restricted European immigration, specifically from Eastern Europe, who were not really viewed as fully white, and who were now associated with the brand new socialist state in Russia, even if they didn't actually come from Russia or any of the Soviet republics. The Nationality Act of 1940 created a unified code for US naturalization law. But speaking of the 1940s, America is moving into a new political era, and after pulling itself out of the largest economic depression in world history, New Deal Democrats were ready to take a crack at immigration policy. The War Brides Act created exemptions to the quota system for relatives of American service members. The Magnuson Act of 1943 restored immigration from China after 61 years. The Luce-Celler Act of 1946 allowed immigrants from India and the Philippines to be eligible for citizenship. This was limited to 100 per country per year because, of course, it was. But why these two countries specifically? Well, India was still a dominion of the British, and they fought with us during the war, and the Philippines was, well, to put it lightly, heavily influenced by us. And they fought with us during the war and were occupied by the Japanese. The Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 updated our immigration laws to better reflect Cold War era fears of communist infiltration. And then we get to the iconic Hart-Celler Act of 1965. This bill removed the quota system, which included the national origins formula, which was designed to promote Western European immigration. It gave priority to relatives and children of US citizens, professionals with specialized skills, and refugees, and limited immigration to 120,000 per year from the Western Hemisphere. Now, this bill was largely a response to the political climate created by the Civil Rights Movement, so thank you, Dr. King, for another fat W on the historical record. This had huge implications in terms of immigration demographics, and as Europe rebuilt, thanks in large part to the Marshall Plan, Western European immigration slowed, and the removal of the quota system allowed for more Asian, African, and South and Central American immigrants to start entering our country. The Refugee Act of 1980, signed into law by Jimmy Carter, created a proper legal framework for accepting refugees. It raised the ceiling for refugees from 17,400 a year to 50,000, and provided a process for adjusting the ceiling to respond to crises, and set up a required annual meeting between Congress and the President to set the limit for the year. It also gave us a legal definition of a refugee, as someone with a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution, aligning our legal definition with that of the UN. Next, we have the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or the IRCA, of 1986. This Reagan-era bill gave some undocumented immigrants a pathway to permanent residency, while simultaneously making the hiring of undocumented immigrants illegal. We'll go more into depth about this amnesty process and its impacts later on in this video. The Immigration Act of 1990, proposed by Ted Kennedy, set a cap of 700,000 immigrants per year until fiscal year 1995, where it was lowered to 675,000. It created a family-based immigration visa and 5 different employment visas, as well as a diversity lottery to allow people from underrepresented countries into the US. For the last major piece of immigration legislation from the 20th century, we have a mouthful. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act of 1996, or the IIR-IRA, made major changes to previous immigration acts. That's the nice way of putting it. Somehow, like most of Bill Clinton's social policies, he manages to be even crueler and more conservative than the Republicans. This bill created a deportation system that eliminated due process and curtailed relief from removal, and further militarized the southern border. Under the IIR-IRA, many legal non-citizens were subject to removal, and offenses deemed deserving of deportation were massively expanded. That being said, the old and frankly quite soft immigration system probably could not handle the strain that our modern immigration system is facing today. Numerous loopholes in residency status were patched by this bill. Annual deportations went from 50,000 100,000 to 200,000, and before the IIR-IRA, non-immigrants who overstayed their visas could simply pay a fine and adjust their status to permanent resident. While the more lenient immigration and deportation system may have worked when the undocumented population was well under 5 million, as it began to skyrocket in the 90s, guardrails became increasingly more necessary. But even then, the IIR-IRA did very little to stop the surge of undocumented immigration into the US. Public opinion became more oppositional to the increasing population of undocumented immigrants, but it looks like there was a huge spike in opposition to immigration as a whole around late 2001. I wonder what could have changed. 9/11 pushed a much more aggressive border policy and shifted the southern border from an economic issue to a national security one. In 2005, the REAL ID Act, designed to help combat terrorism, increased the burden of proof for asylum seekers beyond evidence to an assessment of their demeanor, plausibility, and consistency. The Secure Fence Act of 2006 authorized and partially funded the construction of a 700-mile-long fence along the Mexican border near San Diego and Tijuana. But the last Bush finally got booted from office, and now it's time for the president of hope and progress. From Obama, we got Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in 2012, better known as DACA or the Dreamers program. This bill created a system of renewable 2-year periods of legal status for undocumented children in the US, regardless of how they came. This program gave some respite to the undocumented migrants in an increasingly harsh immigration system. Further immigration reforms were attempted with the Border Security, Economic Opportunity, and Immigration Modernization Act of 2013, but it fizzled out in Congress, and DAPA, which was DACA for parents, was held up in court and eventually rescinded by Trump. Speaking of Trump and DACA, Trump tried to end DACA, but in a 5-4 decision in 2020, he was blocked from this termination because it was done in a, quote, arbitrary and capricious manner. But DACA has currently been prohibited from expansion as of 2023, and no new people can be eligible for it. This brings us up to the modern day, with refugee laws still designed from a softer era of immigration legislation, a hyper-focus on national security on the southern border, and aggressive crackdowns on undocumented immigration both on the border and in our country. In modern America, most immigrants come for 3 reasons: family, jobs, or humanitarian protection. In 2020, Mexico, India, the Philippines, Cuba, and China were the most common countries of origin for immigrants. But of course, a lot of the immigration was reduced during the pandemic because of safety concerns. Our current system is largely still based on the Hart-Celler Act from the 60s and the Immigration Act of the 1990s, or the INA. And of course, our handling of undocumented people varies tremendously from state to state, but our rules and guidelines still come from the IIR-IRA, bolstered by national security bills passed post 9/11. For the first category of immigrants who come for family reasons, out of roughly 1 million green cards, those being permanent resident statuses, given out each year between 2013 and 2017, 45% of recipients were relatives of US citizens, and 21% were family-sponsored. 14% fall in the employment category, and 13% were refugees. This totals to just under 3/4 of total green cards, and the rest are given to people seeking education, the diversity lottery system, or any number of other potential reasons. We also have a temporary visa system for temporary residents, specified in the visa for length of time and location, which is typically for pre-arranged work arrangements or higher education, or of course tourism. But overall, looking at our legal immigration system, the fact that the plurality of people accepted into this country currently have some kind of familial relationship to a US citizen does show that while we do accept a lot of people into our country, for those who do not have family in the US, admission can be incredibly difficult. There is one notable exception to this though, and that is refugees. As stated previously, our refugee system is based largely off of the Refugee Act from 1980, Jimmy Carter's soft, Cold War, American exceptionalist legislation, designed especially for people fleeing South Vietnam after the fall of that regime. We've already gone over the specifics of the bill itself, but its modern implications are clear. Refugee status applications differ from all other types of residency claims in America, and that refugees can apply from their home country or within their first year of entering the US. This is way more lenient than the systems for economic immigrants, which is certainly a good thing, but there are still some inhibiting factors for refugees. Family ties to US citizens are still included in the application, and courts must determine that the applicant has a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution, typically meaning some kind of political or ethnic oppression. Examples include the Uyghur population in the Xinjiang province, the Rohingya population in Myanmar, Syrian refugees either fleeing Assad or the war, refugees fleeing violence in Central or South America, Venezuelans escaping Maduro, Chinese people fleeing political oppression, and maybe, kind of, possibly, sometimes, Palestinians fleeing Gaza. Refugees can have no record of serious crimes and cannot already be resettled in a different country. In 2014, the cap for the amount of refugees let into the country was 120,000. But in 2018, under Trump, the asylum system was heavily scrutinized and regulated. The cap on refugees was reduced to 15,000, and resources to the application process were cut, creating a huge backlog, and more resources to border guards meant more potential asylum seekers turned back from the border. As of 2020, the backlog of asylum claims totaled over 600,000 applicants, and with increasing asylum claims, including a 63% jump in claims in 2023, around 800,000 have fallen into the backlog, awaiting a decision according to Track. Why is this number so high compared to the Trump era? Well, there are 4 reasons. One is an increase in the total number of refugees accepted gives more people hope that they'll be let in. In 2021, Biden raised the cap on refugees to 62,500, and in 2022, raised it again back to 125,000, where it stayed for 2023, which is more than 8 times what it was under Trump. So more people are going to apply for an asylum claim, thinking that they'll get in. The second reason is that migrants have more faith in the decency and fairness of the process under a Democrat president, particularly when contrasted with Trump. A major component of this is what Democrats are supportive of and what Republicans call catch and release for asylum seekers, and we'll go more into detail about what exactly that is later down the line. Another reason is the termination of Title 42, which allows asylum seekers to be expelled along the border for public health reasons. The third main reason is a buildup of people who waited until the end of pandemic restrictions to seek asylum. Beyond fear from both US border officials and migrants, many home countries simply restricted movements of potential asylum seekers. The final reason is the deterioration of many international struggles in places like Myanmar, Ukraine, and Gaza, which have spiked the number of people fleeing from repression. But let's be clear, this is an explanation for why the backlog isn't actively decreasing. The New York Times predicted that resolving the refugee backlog would require about $2 billion in additional investment in terms of immigration judges and support staff into the currently gutted immigration court system. And Biden has poured already more than $1.5 billion into the executive office for immigration review. Absent the 4 previously listed factors, the backlog should have dropped substantially, but of course, the crisis continues. But hold on. According to an August 20th report, in 2023, the backlog stands at 974,571 asylum cases. Does this mean that ICE is holding on to nearly 1 million people at the southern border? Well, no. In fact, most people with pending claims have never actually been detained. Only around 2,000 asylum seekers are actively being detained by ICE, and for a little over 150,000 asylum seekers, they have been caught by the authorities but then released. Why? Well, this comes down to the discussion on catch and release. What is catch and release? Well, it's a loose collection of laws, precedent, and statutes, which essentially allow the release of immigrants into the country while they await court appointments. Basically, it's bail, but for immigrants, without the payment. This means the same analysis of are they a danger or a flight risk is done, but with a little bit less scrutiny because, well, they haven't really been convicted of a crime, other than illegal crossing. So generally, they are released. But do they actually return to their court hearing? Well, according to a 2020 study from the University of Pennsylvania, between 2008 and 2018, 66 to 83% of non-detained immigrants released from custody attended all of their court hearings. That number jumped to 96% for non-detained immigrants with a lawyer, and 15% of those who were ordered deported for their failure to appear successfully in court reopened their cases and had their removal orders rescinded. So that means that for the 1/3 to 1/6 of all non-detained migrants who don't appear for their court hearings, I guess the Republicans were right to just end catch and release? Well, the problem is Republicans didn't, because they couldn't. Trump tried to end catch and release, but there were a few problems. The first is that there were a few cases of precedent that limited how long migrant women and children could be held. That exact maximum period is largely unclear, but indefinite holding of minors is subject to being challenged legally. The second is that detention facilities weren't up to constitutional standards for holding children. As part of the Flores Settlement Agreement, which was a 9-year federal class action lawsuit against the INS for its treatment of children, a set of requirements for how migrant children could be held was outlined. And since then, multiple presidents, including Obama and, of course, Trump, have been found to be violating those requirements. That being said, if Trump wants to end catch and release, he would need to spend a lot of money to make our system handle the influx in migrant children in accordance with federal law. But finally, and the most glaring problem, is that there are just way too many people We've got a lot of migrants held in detention. As of 2023, that's well over 36,000. But just for refugees, at the height of Trump's aggressive border policy in around 2018 to 2019, the number of people held in captivity would have to be tripled. But that's assuming that we'd actually detain them in the US. Didn't Trump want to keep them in Mexico? Yes, he did. But again, we run into a problem. Most notably the fact that migrants can just illegally cross the border again, and they could get hurt, killed, or they could just succeed and stay in America as undocumented, which is kind of exactly what we don't want if they've clearly already expressed interest in going through the legal pathway. So keep in mind, as much as Republicans bitch and moan about catch and release and soft border policy, they never really could end it. So, what can we do to fix our asylum-seeking system? Well, the most glaring issue that is already being addressed by the Biden administration is the complete overflow of cases. The solution is cheap and fast-acting, to provide more resources, judges, officials, and infrastructure to the system. But other than that, our definition, though criticized by media like the New York Times, aligns with the UN definition, and that's not really the problem. Instead, the problem is that the burden of proof for a well-founded fear of repression is quite difficult to meet. In the fiscal year 2023, 36,000 individuals were granted asylum into the United States, well under the cap of 125,000. Why so low? Well, part of it is processing, as we've already mentioned, with over 170,000 asylum seekers having no scheduled hearings at all. But another problem is claim denial rates, which spiked under Trump but have been steadily declining since. Why are approval rates, which have been typically hovering around 40 to 50% under Biden, so low recently? Well, that comes down to a few factors, the first being the sheer complexities of these cases. Life histories and complex political and social contexts need to be established in court, requiring extensive documentation and proof, and in 70% of cases as of February of 2024, without legal representation. Now keep in mind this number was close to 35% under Trump and 20% under Biden earlier on in his presidency. But with the sharp increase in claims and processing, there's been a severe lack of legal representation for asylum seekers. Another factor is the constantly evolving framework of US immigration policy, but the real notable factor is that asylum proceedings are discretionary, meaning that asylum applications can be approved or rejected based on the individual conclusions of an immigration judge. This isn't entirely uncommon in US law, and is absolutely necessary given current circumstances, because even though Biden augmented the number of immigration judges by about 50%, there were still only 682 immigration judges as of December 2023. Nonetheless, it does make asylum claims something of a gamble, because the same set of facts can be interpreted differently by different judges, with little to no structural pushback. So the two main problems are a backlog and low acceptance rates. Luckily, both of these problems can be solved for less than $5 billion. The Congressional Research Services report published July 28, 2023 on immigration judge hiring states that the projected minimum number of additional immigration judges to clear the entire backlog by fiscal year 2032 would be 700, and with attorneys and support staff that would cost about $2 billion. The second problem is denial rates, which are artificially high because of a lack of legal representation. If we simply add more judges, this problem will only get worse, because it would mean more claims, more processing, faster proceedings, and the same amount of legal representation. To address this, Democrat Congresspeople Kirsten Gillibrand and Norma Torres have written and pushed for the 2023 Fairness to Freedom Act, which would provide a few $100 million to put towards legal resources for indigent people facing removal. This would only mean additional legal resources towards defensive claims, those being claims made after a deportation process has begun, and would not directly help the people making affirmative claims, so other steps would need to be taken. Of course, since many of them are not in the country, the political will to help them is basically non-existent, but it seems unfair that they should be punished with a lack of access to affordable representation because we finally start addressing problems with our own immigration system. In conclusion, our asylum seeker problems can be solved with one thing: money. But now we move on to a more complex and nuanced topic: illegal immigration. Let's start with the basics. What exactly is illegal immigration in the US? Well, it's the act of entering the US without proper authorization. But now let's talk numbers. Estimates fluctuate, but it's believed that there are between 11 and 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. However, recent figures from 2016 place that number at 10.7 million, accounting for around 3.3% of the total US population. The peak was in 2007 with approximately 12.2 million illegal immigrants, constituting 4% of the population at that time, but the population has been steadily declining since then. Many conservative pundits will claim that there has been a massive influx in illegal immigration, with more than 1.6 million border encounters in just the fiscal year of 2021, and many more since then. Does that mean that there are an additional 1.6 million undocumented immigrants who live in the US? No. Encounters do not mean entrances. In fact, in 2023, there were approximately 3.1 million attempted border crossings, and that translated to 2.5 million encounters by US Customs and Border Protection. The remaining 600,000 entered undetected. So does this mean an additional 600,000 undocumented immigrants live in America? Well, still no, because many of those migrants came and left, or were deported later. It's interesting to note that historically the majority of undocumented immigrants have been from Mexico. However, that's no longer the case. Their share of the total undocumented immigrant population has been declining, and now there's a more diverse representation from various countries. Moreover, illegal immigrants have become a significant part of the US workforce, with around 7.8 million undocumented workers as of 2021. So what about the laws governing illegal immigration? Well, federal law dictates that undocumented immigrants are subject to removal. The primary legislation includes the IRCA and the IIR-IRA. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, is tasked with the prevention and removal of illegal immigrants. Now, let's touch on some landmark legal cases. Plyer v. Doe in 1982 ruled that undocumented children are entitled to enroll in public schools, and under the Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, undocumented immigrants can receive services from hospitals that accept Medicare. Interestingly, the IRCA also introduced two legalization programs: legally authorized workers, or LAW, and special agricultural workers, or SAW. These programs aim to provide amnesty and legal status to certain undocumented immigrants who met special criteria. Finally, let's discuss legal proceedings surrounding illegal immigration. Most proceedings are civil rather than criminal, meaning individuals do not have the right to counsel or a jury trial. However, Fifth Amendment protections do apply, adding another layer of complexity to the legal landscape. A major aspect of our handling of undocumented immigrants was what we called the revolving door policy. Essentially, people from northern Mexico come to America for work and then come home after a certain period. Could be a day, week, month. The important part is that they maintain legal residence in Mexico. This worked incredibly well for US companies and therefore consumers, because as a system, it was incredibly adaptive to the labor market. It would expand when the demand for labor grew and constrict when work was tight. Nowadays, that system is largely deemed unacceptable. Even before Trump, and particularly after 9/11, the American public demanded a more strict border regime. But many of the concerns about undocumented immigrants are economic. So, are undocumented immigrants good for the economy? Well, let's look at a few studies to discern some arguments. First of all, many conservatives will say that illegals are a fiscal burden, meaning that they collect more benefits from the government than they contribute in taxes. Is this true? Maybe. The 2007 Congressional Budget Office report estimates annual costs of undocumented migrants in Colorado were between $217 and $225 million, compared to $159 to $194 in direct state and local taxes collected. A 2016 Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy report states that undocumented immigrants contributed $11.64 billion to the economy in direct taxes. According to the Texas Cost-Benefit Analysis of Undocumented Immigrants, welfare systems like Medicaid, Children's Health Insurance Program, the ACA, Medicare, TANF, and SNAP are all unavailable to undocumented immigrants, reducing their fiscal burden on states and the federal government. For Texas, they conclude that overall costs total a little over $2 billion, but benefits are roughly $2.4 billion. The Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy's 2013 and 2017 analyses of undocumented immigrants' state and local tax contributions calculated an effective tax rate of just around 8%, but also reported that 50 to 75% of undocumented immigrants pay personal income taxes using a fake social security number. Like other people living and working in the United States, undocumented immigrants currently contribute a significant share of their income to state and local taxes. In addition to paying sales and excise taxes when they purchase goods and services like utilities, clothing, and gasoline, undocumented immigrants also pay property taxes directly on their homes or indirectly as renters. Nonetheless, aside from Texas, it does seem like undocumented immigrants are generally a fiscal burden on the economy. So does this mean they're bad for the economy? Well, no. Let's remember two things. One, we run a huge fiscal deficit, which means that two, for more than half of US households, they get more in benefits than they pay back in taxes. But no one says that the bottom half of the US economy isn't good for the economy because the fiscal cost or benefit from a group is a terrible way of measuring their importance to the economy. According to a 2015 study from the American Action Forum, undocumented immigrants make up 11 million workers in our workforce, and simply removing them would directly cost $400 billion and would reduce our GDP by about $1.6 trillion. Why is this? Well, it's not just because of their role in the labor market, which is massive and absolutely crucial. It is also because their presence in US labor markets both directly reduces the price of goods and services by accepting lower wages than domestic workers. They also reduce the incentive for offshoring. Offshoring had a huge incentive because of low labor costs in other countries. But if a company could get low labor costs and stay in the country, reducing transportation, licensing, and other costs, it's simply a better option for American companies. So let's be clear, undocumented immigrants are great for the economy and make up a crucial role in both propping up our labor market and preventing capital flight. But now let's look at some drawbacks. A 2009 study called On the Macroeconomic and Welfare Effects of Illegal Immigration found 4 potential reasons for why illegal immigration is overall an economic boon, but it can hurt employment opportunities and drop domestic consumption and labor force participation. The first reason is exploitation. More unemployed immigrant workers means less of a change in domestic workers searching for jobs, ergo a more competitive job market. Importantly, the paper does note that this means cheaper goods and more profits, so improvement in overall production and for the consumer. The second reason is the capital using up effect. Undocumented immigrants don't have to save money in our domestic financial system, and many times they don't. Instead, they have remittances, so that's less domestic investment, less business growth, and therefore less jobs. The third reason is the displacement effect. When domestic workers lose their jobs or have a lower likelihood of finding a new job because of an undocumented worker, this depresses their consumption, which in turn depresses profits and business growth. The final reason is the direct wage-depressing effect of legal immigrants. More workers looking for more work means a decrease in wages. This is distinct from the first reason because the first one is specifically measuring the populations of domestic versus immigrant workers, which outlines why domestic workers are impacted more. This reason goes over the broad effect of just adding more people to the labor pool. But there are a few caveats to note in this paper. Firstly, if undocumented workers were removed from the equation, there is a potential that a few of the manual, low-skilled jobs would simply be taken up by Americans, leading to marginal improvements in wages for some local workers. However, the negative impact on job creation of complementary jobs could be more significant. See Ottaviano and Perry 2012, Perry and Sparber 2009, Chasambuli and Perry in 2015. As US workers benefit much more from growth in the intermediate skilled jobs than from the manual-intensive, low-skilled employment opportunities. Some economists even theorize that one of the major reasons that the middle class isn't completely dead in America is because they serve as the managerial class for the unskilled labor market propped up by illegal immigration. Another concern about illegal immigrants is crime. They're not bringing their best idea. However, the 2010 census data reveals that incarceration rates among the young, less educated Mexican, Salvadorian, and Guatemalan men who make up the bulk of the unauthorized population are significantly lower than the incarceration rate among the native-born young men without a high school diploma. In 2010, less educated native-born men aged 18 to 39 had an incarceration rate of 10.7%, more than triple the 2.8% among foreign-born Mexican men, and 5 times greater than the 1.7% among foreign-born Salvadoran and Guatemalan men. This makes sense, given the fact that it is a lot more at stake when an undocumented immigrant is considering committing a crime. Deportation is a far greater deterrent for crime, especially for minor crimes and misdemeanors. So, of course, for people with temporary, conditional, or non-existent visas, crime simply isn't worth the risk. So, let's be clear, undocumented immigrants are a crucial part of our labor force. They have a small but still present wage-depressing effect, but they prop up the middle class of America while committing less crimes than the domestic population. Needless to say, they're pretty good for the economy. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't be better, or that they should be here at all. There's a fundamental fairness issue, where some people have to spend their life savings just for the chance to come into this country, while others circumvent the legal system. But what can we do to address our problems with our undocumented population of now over 11 million? Well, first of all, expulsion is off the table, given the drastic economic effects that it would have on the economy. Anyone who suggests this is deeply unserious and does not actually want to solve the problem. Alternatively, we could pull a Ronald Reagan and give amnesty for undocumented immigrants who have resided in America for a certain length of time. What were the effects of his policy? Well, an analysis of the IRCA from Duke University outlines that 2.7 million undocumented immigrants were granted amnesty. Apprehensions from border crossings decreased in the short term, but returned to normal levels during the period where undocumented immigrants could file for amnesty. Very simply, there really wasn't a long-term impact of amnesty on immigration rates. This is somewhat disappointing, but definitely not bad news. Many conservatives are concerned that more people are going to come over illegally if we will eventually give them legal status. But a one-time amnesty policy really doesn't incentivize more legal immigration. In terms of economic effects, this would increase the effective tax rate of the current undocumented population from 8% to 8.6%, which would directly add another $2.18 billion in taxes. More importantly, it would allow us to focus our border and custom resources on handling issues at the actual border, instead of inside of our nation. Tangible benefits of amnesty aren't exactly clear, but tangible harms are basically non-existent. So honestly, most people who want to see the immigration system fixed should probably support some kind of amnesty. As for how long the period of residence should be to receive amnesty, that's a somewhat open question. Reagan put it at 4 years, but with the current population, as of 2016, approximately 2/3 of illegal adult immigrants have lived in the United States for at least a decade. But the policy specifics are something that should probably be sorted out by institutions like the CBO. But an important note is that amnesty would not address the rapid influx in attempted legal and illegal immigration over these past few years. So what can be done about that? Well, increasing border security is absolutely an option, one that has already been exercised by Biden extensively. In fact, Biden has arrested more people illegally crossing than any other period since 1960. More than 6 million arrests have been made from February 2021 to September 2023, and in just fiscal year 2022, there were 2.3 million apprehensions. So while Biden has enacted many pro-immigrant policies, he is by no means soft on the border. In fact, while we're talking about policy, let's compare Biden's border policy to Trump's. Trump enacted a Muslim travel ban banning immigrants and travelers from Syria, Iran, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Libya, and Iraq for 90 days. The impact of this was primarily impacting students, scholars, and highly educated professionals. Most of the people who came with temporary visas from these countries are involved in some kind of scientific studies. He also reduced the annual cap of refugees to 15,000. He accelerated deportation by targeting undocumented immigrants involved in petty crimes, not just disrupting and threatening the lives of millions of people, but also jeopardizing the stability of economic sectors like agriculture, construction, hospitality, and food services. He promoted an anti-immigrant culture which discouraged thousands of educated migrants from wanting to come over in the first place. And when sanctuary cities attempted to protect undocumented immigrants from aggressive executive orders, Trump retaliated with threats of cutting federal aid and more executive orders for enforcement, which was a wild abuse of power and ruled unconstitutional in 2017. The executive order to build the wall came at a cost of around $10 to $12 billion, but analysts estimated as much as $25 billion. And there's basically no long-term justification for the wall for a few reasons. Firstly, about half of unauthorized immigrants entered legally and then overstayed their visas. Second, for Mexicans and Central Americans, the share of their population, of the total undocumented population, is around 16 to 26%. Immigration from Mexico has trended towards a steady decline. We've seen a temporary surge, but when that dies, we'll have dropped, at the very least, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars, for a border wall for very little benefit that will only minorly inconvenience a percentage of undocumented immigrants. The existing border fence already prevents most of the attempted crossings, and having a full border wall will run through cities and mountains, which is wholly impractical. And for the people that we most want to stop, human traffickers, drug dealers, and hardened criminals, a border wall isn't really going to stop them when they've got an extensive tunnel system, connections with Mexican border agents, and a massive incentive to adapt to whatever conditions we establish. Now let's look at Biden's border policy. First of all, he raised the refugee cap both in 2021 and in 2022, keeping it at 125,000 for 2023. He increased security with numerous executive orders, including increasing the use of expedited removal and an increase of thousands of soldiers to the US border. He expanded legal pathways, announcing new measures to encourage individuals to seek orderly and lawful pathways to immigration. This process worked for Venezuelan immigrants. Biden has expanded the parole process for just Venezuelans to Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Cubans, and has tripled refugee resettlement. He's created an online appointment portal to reduce overcrowding at US ports of entries, and has given $23 million in humanitarian assistance to protect vulnerable populations and prevent the push factors that would draw people to the US border. He's also expanded anti-smuggling operations, provided greater resources to the border, and in one 8-month period arrested 7,300 smugglers. Biden has worked with border cities and NGOs and increased funding for humanitarian aid in border cities for migrants. So let's be clear, if we want to end the illegal immigration crisis and solve the crisis at our southern border, we need both a carrot for legal immigration and a stick for illegal immigration. Trump was more than happy to strengthen this stick time and time again, but Biden has provided both the carrot and the stick, which promotes a long-term solution that will end up reducing the strain on our immigration system. But to sum up long-term solutions to these problems, amnesty for undocumented residents could provide a path forward, as demonstrated by past policies. However, it should be coupled with measures to address the root causes of illegal immigration and bolster border security. Both carrot and stick approaches are necessary for effective immigration reform. Ultimately, the solution lies in comprehensive policies that balance economic considerations, fairness, and security concerns while upholding the principles of humanity and dignity that our nation is founded upon. We're kind of at a crossroads right now, and if we embrace comprehensive immigration reform, we can reaffirm our commitment to uphold our values of opportunity, diversity, and justice for all.